Alright, welcome to this video where I'm going to explain to you in depth the link between PCOS and fertility issues. And the reason I want to make this video, make a really good, informative and educational video for you all, is because nearly every single day I'll get a message from someone saying, hey Drew, I'm having trouble falling pregnant, or I want to fall pregnant, or unfortunately, I've had a few miscarriages. Like, what's going on here? How does PCOS affect my fertility, and how can I improve my fertility chances? So I'm going to do a whole series of these videos, but I had a message this morning about this exactly. And it made me think, because she mentioned in it, I've learned more from your videos than I've learned from my gynecologist or my endocrinologist or my doctor. And that made me realize, like, those specialists unfortunately aren't paid to educate you. They're paid to diagnose you and medicate you. If you look at the whole system, the healthcare system, they don't have time to. Like, you probably get 15 minutes. If you've ever been to a doctor's and there wasn't a huge line, you're lucky. Like, there's always massive lines. You're always an hour later than you should be, and that's because they are overworked, they're overstressed, and they don't really have time to sit down and educate you like I do. I see my role here as an educator, to give you all the information so you can then know exactly what steps to take. So if we're going to talk about PCOS and fertility, very quickly we have to touch on the menstrual cycle, because your ability to fall pregnant is hugely affected by the menstrual cycle, by the fact that you're having regular ovulation. So let's quickly go over the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is controlled by your brain, and it does that via hormones, of course. Hormones are just those little chemical messengers. And when we're talking about the menstrual cycle, we're really looking at 4 hormones. We're looking at 2 hormones sent down by the brain. They are called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. You would have heard me speak about these over and over again. And then the ovaries produce 2 hormones, your sex hormones, so estrogen and progesterone. But as you can see here, at the start of your menstrual cycle, see how follicle stimulating hormone is higher than luteinizing hormone. That is extremely important. Follicle stimulating hormone. Remember, you are born with your lifetime supply of eggs in your ovaries. Those eggs live in what's called follicles, those sacs. So when we're talking about polycystic ovaries, especially with PCOS, we're actually talking about those follicles. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates those follicles. At the start of your cycle, a few follicles or eggs will start to mature, but eventually only one will mature, hopefully into ovulation. So follicle stimulating hormone must be higher because it has to work. It has to stimulate your follicles into maturation, into growing, into forming that egg for ovulation. So the first step here, and if you look at the menstrual cycle, you can just break it down really easy. This happens, then this happens, and this happens, and this happens. So step 1 is FSH has to be higher than LH. And what happens is, as that follicle is starting to mature in the first 2 weeks of your cycle, what's called the follicular phase, that maturing follicle actually releases estrogen. That is where your main source of estrogen comes from. So I haven't written it here, but if you have a look at how estrogen works, estrogen kind of rises like this, and then it comes back down and go up and then back down. So estrogen, this is kind of messy, I'm sorry. Estrogen will rise and it will match that maturing follicle. So that maturing follicle will start to mature, and estrogen levels will start to rise. So that's step 2. Estrogen levels will start to rise as that follicle is maturing. Now, your brain is always looking after what's happening throughout the menstrual cycle. So as estrogen levels rise, they will reach a certain point in your bloodstream. Your brain sees that and says, okay, estrogen levels are up here. That means that follicle must be fully matured. All right, now it's time for ovulation. So it will send down a surge of this LH, luteinizing hormone. So you can see this luteinizing hormone will have this massive surge in the middle of the menstrual cycle. If you're having that regular menstrual cycle, it'll be around day 14, middle of the cycle. And it's that surge of luteinizing hormone that triggers ovulation. So step 3 here is the brain recognizes estrogen levels have reached a certain point. It will then send down luteinizing hormone to trigger ovulation. As we can see here, step 3, luteinizing hormone surge triggers ovulation. Now that follicle that is just cracked open, basically, its egg has come out up the fallopian tube looking for some sperm, maybe if you're trying to fall pregnant. That follicle left over where your egg was living now becomes what's called the corpus luteum. And for the second 2 weeks of your cycle, that corpus luteum becomes your source of progesterone. So when you look at, once again, I haven't written progesterone here, sorry, but when you look at progesterone levels, they'll stay nice and low and then they'll start to come up in the second phase of your menstrual cycle. Once again, progesterone levels will mimic that growth, and then at the end of the cycle, progesterone levels, estrogen levels fall away to get ready for your bleed, what's called menses. Most women refer to as their period. So step 4 here is that leftover follicle becomes the corpus luteum. That is your source of progesterone. And that, in a nutshell, is the menstrual cycle. So let's recap it really quickly so it all makes sense to you. Because remember, the menstrual cycle works as this happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens. Number 1, follicle stimulating hormone is higher than luteinizing hormone, so we can mature that follicle. Step 2, estrogen levels rise as that follicle is maturing. Step 3, when estrogen levels reach a certain point, the brain recognizes that, sends down a surge of luteinizing hormone, which triggers ovulation. And step 4, after ovulation, that follicle in which your egg was living now becomes the corpus luteum, which is your source of progesterone. So now if we look at, all right, optimize your chances of falling pregnant, you're going to try to do everything you can to regulate your menstrual cycle, have a healthy menstrual cycle. Because if you're having a menstrual cycle every 28 days, you know, well, 14 days before my period, that's when I'm ovulating. That's when my chances of falling pregnant are most high. It's in this phase here, like a 3 to 4 days of each month. But if you're not having a regular menstrual cycle, of course, or you have an irregular menstrual cycle, it's going to be very hard for you to know when you're ovulating. But what happens in PCOS that messes this menstrual cycle up is it starts at the start. So as we know, one of the hallmarks of PCOS is high testosterone levels, what's called excess androgens or hyperandrogenism. And what happens is when you have excess amounts of testosterone in your bloodstream, luteinizing hormone is largely under the direction of ovarian androgens. So when your androgens from your ovaries are high, luteinizing hormone is high. So if you need at the start of your cycle follicle stimulating hormone to be higher than luteinizing hormone to kick off your menstrual cycle, but with PCOS your luteinizing hormone is higher than your follicle stimulating hormone, it means your follicle cannot mature. If your follicle cannot mature, there's no growing release of estrogen, which means there is no surge of luteinizing hormone, which means there is no ovulation. No ovulation means you can't conceive because there's no egg there waiting for spermentation. So as we always know, PCOS at its core is creating a bunch of hormonal imbalances. To optimize your chance of falling pregnant and fertility, you need that delicate hormonal balance, especially we're talking about follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, therefore estrogen, progesterone, but we're also talking about insulin and androgens, testosterone, because they impact this delicate balance. And what we know too, which is once again how PCOS creates these double-edged swords, is PCOS can create high testosterone levels. High testosterone levels create high luteinizing levels, luteinizing hormone levels, but then high luteinizing hormone levels also create high testosterone levels. So it exacerbates itself. So once again, we're talking about, all right, how do we maximize our fertility chances? We're going to be looking at the two impacting factors that impact this balance. That's going to be insulin levels and testosterone levels. And that requires that holistic approach that I'm always talking about. Diet, exercise, supplementation, sleep, and reducing stress. That's what I call the 5 C's PCOS lifestyle. But I hope this video was educational for you. As I said, although sometimes I like to bash doctors, I just had that realization this morning that, look, they're stressed, they're people. A lot of them are very good people, but they don't really have time to sit here and educate you. And it's not their job to educate you, where it's my job to do this. So I hope you found this video very informative. If you have any questions at all, let me know, and I'll see you next time on our next video about PCOS.